For hundreds of great shows like this one, go to OnNetworks.com.
Play Value is brought to you by Xbox Live Marketplace.
"500 years of books, and we still get books on paper. 100 years of film, still pretty much the same medium. Video games change every 5 or so years. The whole market changes. There's a shakeup every 5 years, and it doesn't matter what you did. It's all about the next system."
In the 35 years of video games, you have all these consoles, the big ones, Xbox, Nintendo, even the Genesis. A lot of people know what it was. But for every one of those, there's 5 of them that didn't make it.
1978. What's big in 1978? The Atari 2600. So of course everyone else has to come out with their own consoles to compete with that. One of the ones you don't really remember anymore is the Magnavox Odyssey 2.
Great system, really, had some nice horsepower under it, but Atari bought up rights to third-party games like Space Invaders, Pac-Man. So by the time the Odyssey 2 came out, they really just didn't have the content to compete, except for Casey Munchkin, which I don't even really need to describe it in much detail. All you need to know about it is that it's a ripoff of Pac-Man.
There were a couple of differences. There weren't as many dots, the mazes were different, but it was just close enough to be legally actionable. And if Atari thinks something is legally actionable, they're gonna action it. So why did the Odyssey 2 fail? Well, Casey Munchkin was their mascot, and if he's tied up in court, you got nothing left.
At the end of the day, Atari controlled the content, which, as you'll see throughout history, is what dictates which consoles live and which consoles die.
Now, the biggest threat to the original Atari 2600 came from the Intellivision. This was a cool little system that was actually a 16-bit system 10 years before the Sega Genesis.
And this is interesting because Intellivision wasn't a complete failure. Here you had a company who came up with a pretty powerful machine with some interesting innovations. They had a directional pad instead of a joystick.
And just like the Genesis and later the Xbox, they kind of positioned themselves as the more adult console for kind of the sports crowd, the mature crowd, the kind of, hip, young, adult kind of group of people.
They actually really focused on sports games. They had a baseball game that sold more than 1 million copies. They had George Plimpton, the sportscaster, shill as Mr. Intellivision in some ads. And they actually did well at first because of it, and decided to parlay that strength into what I'd call video game mistake number 1.
What do? Well, they just completely spaz out. They start releasing all these peripherals. They had a keyboard add-on. They had the Intellivision 2, 3, and 4. They had kind of a computer add-on that turned it into kind of a very primitive computer. They had a whole separate computer they built that was a standalone PC. It was just too much hardware, not enough software.
They cluttered the market and forgot the fundamental rule. If you don't have good games, no one's gonna care.
Atari releases the 5200 console system in 1982. There were a number of problems that plagued that system that really didn't make it as successful as it could have. Number 1, the controllers. These controllers they were cool to look at, but what was the problem with those controllers was that there was no centering of the joysticks.
It was such a strange thing because it would just flop to one side, like you couldn't get it back in the middle, and it was really, this looks really strange right here, but yeah, the thing was terrible.
Number 2 was that the 5200, for all its glory, wasn't able to play 2600 games. You're just telling your consumer, well, hey, thanks for spending all your money, and now here's the new stuff that you can't use any of your old stuff with.
Basically, it was the first instance of this whole backwards compatibility thing that still plagues systems. The Xbox 360 is still having trouble playing many of the best original Xbox games.
In the long list of things that game companies refuse to learn, backward compatibility.
Let's talk about another failure. Actually, I wouldn't even necessarily call it a complete failure, but the Sega Master System was one that just couldn't quite do it.
Nintendo made some of the best first-party games of all time, like Mario and Zelda, but beyond that, they had some of the best third-party support from companies like Capcom and Konami. They were just giving them gifts in the form of games like Castlevania, Metal Gear, Bionic Commando, the list just goes on and on.
Nintendo had pretty much made exclusive deals with its third-party companies like a Konami, like Capcom, basically saying to them, if you make games for us, we don't really want you making games for other companies. And basically, I mean, they effectively blackballed Sega from being able to work with some of the best gaming companies that were out there.
It was up to Sega to make their own games, and they were okay at it, but they were no Nintendo. It would have been impossible for them to match the creative force of Nintendo, Capcom, Konami, just all the companies combined.
There was one flaming car wreck on the side of the video game highway that some people remember kind of fondly, and that is the Vectrex.
It was a home-based system that played 3D vector graphics. It didn't actually plug in your TV. It came with its own little 9-inch monitor. Now, vector graphics were interesting because they were actually being used back in the day as a way to create 3D graphics in games. And like one of the best examples is probably one of my favorite games too of all time is the Star Wars arcade game. So Vectrex tried to bring that excitement home.
Oh, it failed because you couldn't hook it up to your TV. There were only so many games you could make out of just white lines coming at you. And today it's kind of it's a curio, it's an oddity, but it still has its fans.
Let's add another log to the fire. Talk about the Atari 7800. If the Atari 7800 had come out any earlier, it would have been a nice system. Problem was, this is about 2 years too late.
Their big titles are Pole Position 2 and Miss Pac-Man, neither of which are big improvements over the originals, which are great games, but they're ancient. They're literally ancient. I mean, you have things like Zelda going on, like really revolutionary stuff, and they're still making maze games. And Pac-Man's a classic, but there's new classics being made, like Mario and Zelda.
Launching with Ms. Pac-Man in 1986, man, is like coming out with a DVD player and packing in like Birth of a Nation.
Every successful console has one game that sells the system, a Mario, a Sonic, just something that moves it, that makes people say, that's the one I need to play this game.
In the industry, there's a term that everyone uses called killer app. Now, killer app stands for killer application, and a killer application is an application, a game, a killer title that help drive the sales of the console. If the console does not have a killer app or a group of titles that people really want to buy, the system will fail.
Atari knew it. That's why they locked down the licenses for Space Invaders, for Pole Position, for Pac-Man. These huge games that are sort of driving the success of these systems.
Looking back, the 35 years of gaming, the top console from each and every era had a killer application. Something that is unique to that device.
Nintendo has Mario and Zelda. Genesis has Sonic.
You have the Game Boy. Game Boy had Tetris, the most simplistically designed game and greatest selling game of all time.
The original PlayStation, they had Tomb Raider, they had Resident Evil. These are games you just had to play. On the PlayStation 2, they had Grand Theft Auto, changed the face of gaming forever.
Xbox One comes out. The killer app on Xbox, Halo.
They never would have gotten anywhere without Halo. They really wouldn't have.
And today on the current generation, the Xbox 360, well, Gears of War, that's the killer app for that. For the PlayStation 3, the jury's still kind of out. We don't really have a killer app yet, and maybe that's why it's not selling so well.
These consoles all succeeded because they had games that people just were dying to play. The ones that couldn't get those games, for whatever reason, were the ones that lost it.
Rated E10 plus the T. Play the games everyone wants to play.
For hundreds of great shows like this one, go to OnNetworks.com.